First of all, let's have a quick recap on last tutorial. Last tutorial, we took a comparison between how to elect a member of the House of Representatives and how to elect a member or a potential candidate for presidency in Egypt. As we concluded from last tutorial, the conditions required to elect the member of House of Representatives are more flexible than the one required for the presidency. Number one, the minimum age of House of Representatives was 25 years old. Unlike for the president, it was higher than 25 years old. The parents of the candidate running for presidency, they also must be Egyptians and they cannot hold another nationality. This one was less flexible with regard to the parliament. The same goes with the conditions in order to become a potential candidate for presidency. He must get the approval of recommendations either from the parliament or a huge number of endorsements from the people from all over the country. Today we are going to start a new topic that is related to the sources of legislation, and we will talk about the formal sources of law. Today we are going to explain and understand what are the formal sources of law that we previously took in the first lectures when we took the formal sources of law and informal sources of law. So what are these formal sources of law? No matter how much effort a legislator undertakes, he will never be able to decide all the legal rules necessary to regulate community, hence the need for informal sources. So in parallel, after having the formal sources of law, we will be explaining the informal sources of law. But first we need to understand the formal sources of law. According to Article 1 of the Civil Code, provides that legislative provisions shall govern all matters to which these provisions apply in letter or spirit, and in the absence of a provision of law that is applicable, the judge shall decide according to custom, and in the absence of custom, then in accordance with the principles of Islamic law, and in the absence of such principles, the judge shall apply the principles of natural justice and the rules of equity. So this basically means that whenever a judge is having a certain lawsuit, there's a certain hierarchy that must be respected by this judge. First, in order to be able to solve the dispute or the quarrel before him, he must refer to the legislations. If he couldn't find the solution in the legislations, then he must check the second norm, which is the customs. If he still couldn't find the solution in the customs, then he is going to refer to the principles of Islamic law. Yet he didn't find the solution, he might refer to the natural justice and rules of equity, which are somehow vague norms. What's the meaning of rules of natural justice? These are rules that were developed. Their content is not really defined and might be unclear and vague. For example, the rules of natural justice, if we have the duty of the dominant part to act fairly, not to treat with dignity the rights of the other party who might be a weak party. For example, if we have a relationship between creditor and debtor, okay, and there's a dispute between them. While having this dispute before the judge, then this judge must put into consideration that the dominant party, which is the creditor, is acting fairly towards the weak party, which is the debtor. The same goes to if we have a relationship and a dispute between an employer and employee and went to the court. This judge, according to the rules of natural justice, he must make sure that the dominant party, who is the employer, is acting fairly towards the weak party, which is the employee. And then we have the rules of equity that are also not that clear. According to this principle, all should be treated equally with no discrimination. The influence of religion on laws in countries of the East. The Islamic religion is both religion and state. For the daily life mundane, it's in the financial dealings. It was inspired by the Islamic religion, and also for the religious issues, when to pray, heaven and hell, all these rules were coming from the Islamic religion. Complete and comprehensive study, we have the Islamic law is divided into two parts: the divine provisions and the Islamic doctrine. What's meant by the divine provisions? These are provisions of Islamic law from the Quran and the Sunnah, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. As for the Islamic doctrine, these were provisions deducted by jurists and scholars. So these are new issues and new problems that we later on faced, and the Muslim scholars like Abu Hanifa and the other scholars, they developed solutions to the problems based and concluded from the Quran and Sunnah, and this is called Islamic doctrine. The influence of religion on the Egyptian law in modern times. Since the Islamic conquest of Egypt and up to the reign of Muhammad Ali, Islamic law or Sharia became its official law. Except in personal status matters, the law of each person's religion will govern his status. Muhammad Ali began to adopt many of the rules of the French law, particularly as regards to trade issues and penalties. So in the beginning, the whole rules were inspired by the Islamic law, but eventually Muhammad Ali began to take parts, to cancel them from the Islamic law and to copy these parts from the French law, especially with regard to the trade issues and the penalties. Until the change in 1875, Ismail Pasha reformed the judiciary and enacted the codes based on the French code. So from this date, Ismail Pasha revoked most of the Islamic law and were substituted by the French code in a lot of matters, yet a huge part of Islamic law still applies in other matters. There is a difference between principles of Islamic law that are considered as a secondary source of legislation in accordance with Article 1 of the Civil Code, and principles of Islamic law as a primary source of legislation according to Article 2 of the Constitution. So what's the differences between the two references? First of all, we need to understand that the legislator, basically the House of Representatives, whenever they are going to enact a new legislation, they look to the principles of Islamic law in their eye as a primary source of legislation. As a consequence, if they are going to enact a new legislation, this new legislation should abide by the principles of Islamic law and cannot contradict it. So, in the phase of enactment of legislation, we consider the principle of Islamic law as a primary source of legislation. Okay, so when is it going to be considered as a secondary source of legislation? In the eyes of the judge who is going to apply the law. So whenever we have a certain dispute or a certain quarrel before the judge must first refer to the formal sources of law in the hierarchy that we took before. So first of all, he is going to refer to legislation. If he couldn't find a solution in legislation, he is going to check into the custom. If he couldn't find a solution in the custom, then in this case, he is going to refer to the principles of Islamic law, and this is why in this case, it's going to be considered as a secondary source of legislation in the eye of the judge who applies the legislation. So again, to resume, the judge, when he applies the law, he is going to refer to the principles of Islamic law as a secondary source of legislation. While the legislator, the House of Representatives, when he is going to enact the legislation, then he is going to consider legislation as a primary source that he cannot breach or cannot violate under any circumstances. Rules of Islamic law and Christian law as primary sources of legislation with regard to personal status matters, each applies to his members. And here we need to have examples in order to understand this. So, if we have Muslims, for their personal status matters, they apply Islamic law. The same goes with Christian law. The Christians, in their personal status matters, they apply Christian law. So, if we have two Muslims are married, consequently, the applicable law here will be the Islamic law in their marriage and divorce. The same goes to if we have two Christians, same religion and same sect. For example, if both of them are Coptic, then the Coptic Christian law is going to be applied to their marriage and divorce if it allows the divorce. So when will be the problem? If we have two different religions, two persons with different religions got married in Egypt, which applicable law here is going to be applied? For example, if we have a Jewish who is married to a Christian woman in Egypt, if they want to get divorced and if they want to get married, how can we validate their marriage? Through Islamic law. Why is Islamic law the one validating their marriage? Because Islamic laws, rules related to marriage and divorce, are considered to be a civil contract. It's not a religious contract. So they refer to Islamic law on its basis only to validate their marriage. This doesn't mean that Islamic law will be applicable in daily lives. No, this is only to allow them the option of getting married. Okay. Another example, if we have two Christians, two Egyptian Christians, one of them is Orthodox and for example the other one is Catholic, okay? They, according to their respective sects of religion, they are not allowed to be married, but based on the principles of the Islamic law, they will have the right to get married on the basis of the civil marriage under the Islamic law. And again, these Christian people, whether they are Orthodox and Catholics, they will not abide by the rules of Islamic law in their daily lives. They only are given the Islamic law to validate their marriage and divorce only. Another thing to be added, you need to understand that the rules of Islamic law with regard to the rules of inheritance are applied on all Egyptians, whether they are Muslims or they are Jews or they are Christians, because in their respective religion there is no rules related to inheritance. This is why the Islamic law here is going to be applicable to fill only their gaps. Principles of Islamic law. The reference to the principles of Islamic law, which is called Sharia, as a secondary source of legislation. Again, reference to principles of Islamic law Sharia is restricted to matters in which the Egyptians are not governed by the provisions of their respective religion. Reference is only to general principles and not to details, as principles are undisputable. What's the meaning of this point? Here we are confirming that the references of principles of Islamic law is only related to the general rules and guidelines of the Islamic law and not to the detailed provisions. For example, if here in Egypt, if you are going to steal, okay, you are going to be punished. This is based on the principle of Islamic law that you are not allowed to steal. This is not a good deed, okay? So this is why you will be penalized, you will go to jail. Here we are going to apply the principle of Islamic law and not the detailed provisions of Islamic law, because the application of detailed provisions of Islamic law means that if you are going to steal, we are going to cut your hand, and this is not applied here in Egypt. Number 3, as far as civil law is concerned, principles of Islamic law are more defined. So they are more clear and they are more defined. They are more easily to be interpreted rather than the rules of equity and natural justice. This is why it prevails and it's in a higher grade in the hierarchy of the formal sources. Again, to summarize the principles of Islamic law, for the judges, it's considered to be a secondary formal source with regard to deciding cases according to Article 1 of the Civil Code, while for the legislator or the House of Representatives, it's considered to be a principal and a basic source of legislation, and accordingly, the House of Representatives discussing any new legislation, they should consider principles of Islamic law in their eye and they are not allowed to violate it. Let's have this classwork in order to make sure that you understood this tutorial. We will have 2 exercises. The first one will be true or false and justify. The second one will be complete the sentence. I will be giving you in this first exercise and also the second one 30 seconds to think about the correct answer. Number 1. In absence of law, the judge shall then directly refer to principles of Islamic law. The correct answer is, in absence of law, the judge shall then directly refer to customs after the law. Why customs if there's an absence in the law? Because, as I told you before, there's a certain hierarchy for the formal sources. So if the judge couldn't find the right solution in the law, he must then check into the custom, which is the second grade of formal sources. Number 2, the judge, when having a dispute, the first formal source he will be checking is customs. The correct answer is the judge, when having a dispute, the first formal source he will be checking is the laws. Again, the judge, when having a dispute, he must respect a certain hierarchy, and the first formal sources hierarchy will be to check in the laws. Number 3, Islamic law only includes religious provisions. This is a wrong sentence. It's a false sentence. Islamic law doesn't only include religious provisions, it also includes financial dealings, and it's both a religion and a state. Number 4, divine provisions of Islamic law are Quran and Sunnah. So this one is a correct answer. It's a true answer. The divine provisions of Islamic law, they are the Quran and the Sunnah. Question number 5. Islamic doctrine or provisions deduced by Muslim jurists. This is also a correct answer. The Islamic doctrine. They are provisions that were concluded by Muslim jurists and scholars. Number 6. Ismail Pasha in 1875 enacted the Egyptian codes based on English law. This is a false sentence. Ismail Pasha in 1875 enacted our Egyptian codes based on the French law. Question number 7. Principles of Islamic law are considered as a secondary source of legislation in accordance with Article 2 of the Constitution. This is a false sentence. Principles of Islamic law are considered as a secondary source of legislation in accordance with Article 1 of the Egyptian Civil Code, as this part is related to the application of the law by the judge. Question number 8. Principles of Islamic law are considered as a primary source of legislation based on Article 1 of the Civil Code. This is a false sentence because principles of Islamic law are considered as a primary source of legislation based on Article 2 of the Constitution, and this is related to the part of the enactment of legislation. So the legislator considers principles of Islamic law as a primary source. Question number 9. The judge in Egypt applies principles of Islamic law as detailed provisions. This is a false sentence. In Egypt, principles of Islamic law is considered to be a secondary source of legislation. So the judge in Egypt applies principles of Islamic law as general provisions and provisions only. So for example, in Egypt, if you are going to steal, we are not going to cut your hands, as cutting hands is a detailed provisions in Islamic law, and Egypt only applies principles of Islamic law. Question number 10. When a judge decides a case, he applies principles of Islamic law as a primary formal source. This is a false sentence, because when a judge decides a case, he applies principles of Islamic law as secondary formal source, because principles of Islamic law comes after the laws and after the customs. Question number 11. The Parliament, when enacting laws, they refer to principles of Islamic law as a secondary source. This is a false sentence, as the Parliament, when enacting laws, they should refer to principles of Islamic law as a basic source of legislation, and consequently this House of Representatives cannot enact a legislation that contradicts the principles of Islamic law. Exercise number 2, which is complete the missing word in the sentence. I will also give you 30 seconds in order to be able to complete the sentence. Number 1. In the absence of a provision of law that is applicable, the judge shall decide according to in the absence of a provision of law that is applicable, the judge shall decide according to customs. So if he couldn't find a solution in the laws, he will be checking the second formal norm, which is customs. Number 2. In absence of a provision of law and customs that is applicable, the judge shall decide according to So in this case, if the judge couldn't find the solution first in the law and second in the customs, then the judge in this case he shall decide according to principles of Islamic law. Number 3. Islamic law is both a religion and a So, Islamic law is not only including religious provisions, it also goes beyond this. So, Islamic law is both a religion and a state. Question number 4. Divine provisions of Islamic law include Quran and these divine provisions, they are untouchable of Islamic law. They include the Quran and the Sunnah, or the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. Number 5. Islamic doctrine are provisions deduced by these Islamic doctrines or provisions that were concluded and deduced by Muslim scholars. Number 6. Since the Islamic conquest in Egypt up to the reign of Muhammad Ali, what became its official law? So, starting from the Islamic conquest in Egypt and until the reign of Muhammad Ali, the Sharia or the Islamic law, they both became its official law. Number 7. Principles of Islamic law are considered as what of legislation according to Article 1 of the Civil Code. So, principles of Islamic law are considered as a secondary source of legislation according to Article 1 of the Civil Code. So again, if the judge is going to apply the formal sources to solve the quarrel before him, they should first check into the laws and the customs. So this means the application of the law for the judge is considered to be a secondary source of legislation. Number 8. Principles of Islamic law are considered as a what source of legislation according to Article 2 of the Constitution. In this case, principles of Islamic law are considered to be a primary or basic source of legislation according to Article 2 of the Constitution. So when the legislator or the House of Representatives is going to enact a new law, they are going to refer to principles of Islamic law as a primary source of legislation. Consequently, they cannot contradict any of its general provisions. Number 9. If two Muslims want to get a divorce, we apply what? So, if two Muslims were married and they want to get a divorce, we apply the Islamic law. Number 10. Islamic laws, rules of inheritance are applied on all Egyptians regardless of their respective Islamic laws, rules of inheritance are applied on all Egyptians regardless of their respective religion. So if we have an Egyptian Christian or an Egyptian Jewish or an Egyptian Muslim, all of them, they will be bound by the Islamic rules of inheritance.